where we think about reform is either how do we tinker with the existing system to make it work a little bit better than it does, or it looks like how do we dismantle that system by creating charter schools through choice as an alternative.
I think we have charters because the neighborhood schools really weren't producing the outcomes.
We can choose to respond to that by trying to create an escape hatch for a small population of kids through things like charter schools, or we can demand equity and adequate funding for all kids.
I first started through a peer in the early 1990s. Minnesota was the first place, and they sort of gained momentum over the years.
Charter schools came into being on the promise that they would be innovative and that they would offer new possibilities for educating kids that in turn would influence what's happening in public schools. Well, I would say the vast majority of charter schools are not innovative. They're pretty ordinary, and there's no learning across charter and public schools. There's a competition.
First of all, charter schools on average don't outperform schools in their neighborhood. There's a long body of research. The number is probably around 80% don't perform better than traditional public schools.
The schools that do better, there's a direct correlation between them and the socioeconomic status of the children who go there.
In the kind of public imagination, they're thought of as better schools. There's something broken about the public bureaucracy, and that only things that are separate and apart from that public bureaucracy can function well, and you want your child in a well-functioning place, so you're going to do that.
They were originally thought of as places of innovation, free of different types of regulations.
The kind of regulations that many public schools work under are onerous. They keep administrators preoccupied with being in compliance with all kinds of rules and regulations, and as opposed to focused on how to meet the needs of kids. You know, something as simple as ordering a desk if you need one. You can do that through the district and take months for the desk to arrive. At a charter school, you can just go to Staples, get the desk, and now you've got the desk. We've made it too hard to run public schools.
If you're a strong principal or strong school leader, you're going to want to have some kind of creative control. You're going to want to, you have ideas, you have a vision. It's important to give principals freedom. If we want to attract good people, we have to create environments where great people want to work.
Policymakers who are interested in promoting charters should say, well, if what works for charters should be, then we should make that available to public schools too.
They have curricular autonomy. They have the ability to carry money over from one year to the next. They have the ability to spend cash rather than get services. They have more control over hiring and firing. All of those things are the innovations that matter. It's not that they've thought up a new reading program. If you give schools the right conditions, and if you give administrators the right conditions, and if you give teachers the right conditions, then good things will happen.
Theoretically, charters get the same amount of money as traditional schools in Baltimore City. We receive more cash as a charter school, and the traditional school receives less cash, but theoretically more services. Charters do pay rent if we're in a public building, like we're in this public building. I pay about $300,000 in rent, but it still ends up being more money that you get as a charter than a traditional school.
With all of the fiscal issues that are going on in Baltimore City, choosing the high price option to educate our children that does not have a success formula that it truly educates them makes no sense to me.
I think that one of the great things that makes the charter legislation in Maryland different than charter legislation in other states is that every teacher in a charter school in Maryland is a member of the collective bargaining unit.
It protects against privatization.
The Republican governor campaigned on his support for charter schools. And one of his promises during the campaign was that he was going to change the way charter schools are authorized. What the legislation was about was making it easier for corporations to come in and run charters.
It took teachers out of the main collective bargaining unit.
The current legislation is better for teachers because it maintains our union protections. If individual charter schools could determine those issues for their teachers, you would take away professionalism, you would end up censoring teachers, there wouldn't be any kind of job protection. I had taught in a charter or in a system where charter school teachers weren't protected by unions before, and it was possible for a school to basically work their employees to death, which led to high turnover rates in charters in Chicago, which creates destabilization.
And this is a tactic that we've seen in charter schools across the United States. In the market-based system, we take a plate of spaghetti, we throw it against the ceiling, and see what sticks. That's our approach to teacher quality in charter schools.
Because if we're defending the profession, we should be making sure that professional standards are maintained, that teachers are supported, that ineffective teachers are not allowed to stay.
Another piece of the governor's legislation which was of concern would be for charters to work with teachers who were not credentialed or certified.
What they're trying to do is decrease the regulation, decrease the accountability for teacher turnover, decrease the accountability for teacher quality, decrease the accountability for equity and access for students of color and low SES students. Those are all things that they want off the table.
The legislation allows them to pick and choose.
Are we okay with schools limiting equity and access based on test scores? Part of the challenge is that there are parents that are okay with that idea.
You ask middle-class families, would they put their kids in Baltimore public schools? And most will say no. And so if you want middle-class people to live in Baltimore, where are they going to put their kids in school?
What charter schools have succeeded in doing is bringing more white and more middle-class families into the school system. The problem is when you start giving those schools more and more privileges based on their successes.
If the question is, how do we attract more middle-class families into Baltimore and get them to send their children to public schools, the answer is to make all those schools good.
Charter schools are creaming students, and they're avoiding the special ed students, they're avoiding the ELL students because they're more expensive to educate and more challenging to educate, and then those kids are concentrated in the traditional public schools, and that's especially when you look at those statistics comparing charter schools to schools that are nearby.
We do need a central office. It's why we do need public education with the good of all children at heart.
You can never make a middle-class parent put their kids in a bad school because they simply will refuse and will exercise the option. You can only do that to poor people. From a policy standpoint or from a community standpoint, we have to think about all the kids, not just some kids. So the question is, how do we serve the most disadvantaged kids who almost never get picked up in a choice system?
What is it that parents want to be able to choose? The top of the list is more parental involvement, then more funding for schools, less testing, more extracurriculars, higher quality teachers, and way down that list, coming in sixth place, is charter schools. Everything that I mentioned above charter schools costs more money. Higher quality teachers cost more money than teachers that only have 5 weeks of training in the summer, which are those of the teachers that are primarily populating charter schools. A lot of legislators like charter schools because they see it as something that they can go back to their constituents and say, we did something, but did they actually do something?
I think the policymakers need to realize that they are part of the problem. The laws focus on keeping schools in compliance with regulation, not on whether or not the needs of children are actually being met. I think what we should insist upon is transparency with respect to funding and how money's being used. We should insist on due process rights for parents. Kids can't just be kicked out of schools. They have to come up with some standards and say every school should have X. They should have a library. They should have teachers who are certified. They should have decent facilities. That is, and they should be accountable to make sure all the ingredients are there to give that school a chance. We don't have a state in the country that's done that. In education, we hold the consumer accountable, even though the consumer has no say over the quality of what they're getting.
With a charter school that is run by a large management company, a large corporation, because many of the management companies are corporations, you have no say in how they perform the business of the school.
At least there's some recourse. In the traditional system, you can go to the school board, you can go to the superintendent and complain.
Do we want democratically controlled schools or do we want privately controlled schools? If you look at community-based charters, you can make an argument that they're more democratically controlled because they are collaborations between various groups in the community. The corporate charters are often outsiders coming into communities with franchises. A lot of people will respond to that and say, well, you can vote with your feet and not go to those charter schools. But if you don't have the resources, if you don't have the car, if you can't drive your kid across town, or if you don't want to put your child on a bus, like in New Orleans for a couple of hours, then there is no voting with your feet.
People should not be making profits off of our children.
We talk about democracy and how important democracy is, but yet the current conversation in school reform is that how can just a few people make decisions about everything, about the Common Core standards, where the testing companies had more than half of the people in the room when they developed those standards, about assessment, where Pearson makes the decisions about assessment. When I grew up, my teachers made the decisions about assessment. That's community-based assessment. How do we make communities, how do we make them the solution? And the way we do that is via democratic processes at the community level. Of course, that's messy.
I believe in community-controlled, community engagement. It takes time. It takes time, and you have to view that work as organizing work, to organize parents so that they understand what their roles and responsibilities are in relation to the schools.
One of the things that I am hopeful for is this new endeavor called community schools. Embracing the concept of a neighborhood, the school, and the community surrounding it, working together to achieve greater outcomes for our children.
When you accept the political premise that charter schools are a solution to a failing public system, you have accepted the idea that there are some schools that are just not going to be good schools.
Simply saying let's have more charters is overly simplistic, is searching for a silver bullet, and is not a solution.